round trip. It was probably about 20, I think it was about 20 miles.
20 miles. Yeah. Bill, just keep us at a wide shot.
You got it?
And then I'll do an introduction and you can zoom in on me if you want.
No problem.
So that's cool. I forget what kind of bike you have. It's an
87 Kawasaki.
650?
It's a 450.
450, yeah.
So it's okay for a beginner bike.
I had a Nighthawk once, a 650, and that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
I lived in an apartment though,
Yeah.
and I parked it on the street, and some guy backed into it and knocked it over.
Oh no!
It's terrible.
No.
Anyway, you want to get started?
Sure.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Holy Isle podcast. My name is Drew Foisey. I'm the vicar here at St. Aidan's Episcopal Church on beautiful Camino Island. I'm so glad you're with us, joining us. We have a very special guest today. He is an ordained Lutheran minister, has been for, I want to say, 15, 20 years?
Over 20 years.
Over 20 years. He studied at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago and has served several parishes around the Puget Sound region, and now works and has his ministry with the Northwest Washington Synod, of which he is a part. It is my great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, the Reverend Andy Yee. Andy, welcome.
Thank you, brother. Good to be here with you.
I'm glad you're here. I don't get to do these very often, but when I do, it's always more fun to do it with people you know and really like.
Yeah.
I've gotten to know you since I've been here, which is 6 years, I think, now, which is crazy to me.
Yeah.
And you've been a constant friend and support, and I'm just really grateful for you in so many ways. So
Same here.
thank you for agreeing to just come hang out and
Yeah.
be on the podcast and chit chat.
It's good to be here with you.
You have a couple kids, 17 and 15.
Yep.
Which means when I arrived, I remember them, and they were 10 and 8 or something like that. And there's a big difference between a 10-year-old and a 17-year-old.
That's right.
What has it been like for you being the father of a 17-year-old during a pandemic?
Oh man, it's we've had to kind of dig in and do some really a lot of soul searching and discerning of how to best raise my 17-year-old. There's some things that he is asking for now that he that never was an issue before. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, just yesterday, he wanted to see if he can have his own account online, and he has his own debit card and everything like that. So it took a while for us to kind of adjust, because before everything was run through us. Mm-hmm. If he wanted to buy anything, we always got a notification. And so now with this adult setup, he's got some freedom. So it's been a little bit of an adjustment.
I'm not a parent, but I am always interested in the way kids are growing up, and technology has just radically impacted our lives in ways we couldn't imagine, even just 5 or 7 or 8 years ago. And this has radically impacted the lives of kids who find their social lives through technology, through apps, and it's not always a cut and dry thing about how you modulate what's the word?
Like balance.
Balance and, what did I say, anyway, I forgot the word. But what has been your philosophy personally around screen time?
Yeah. So I try to talk to my boys about balance, and that to me is important. And so I'm grateful that both of them have been involved with Boy Scouts and have had not only you know the physical but also the mental kind of stimulation that came with that.
Yeah.
So that carries through. So like my youngest son, you know, he loves playing video games, and on the video games, you know, these days you can also play with your friends on the video games, even if they're not there. And then so he's been doing a lot of that. But he also balances it with time that he is trying to go out with his buddies in the neighborhood, riding bicycles, throwing footballs, and things like that. And so so I really appreciate that. Because we talk to them about, we should have a good balance with things, that they've kind of followed along with that. And so I'm grateful for that. And I can talk to them about balance, and they'll have a conversation with me about it. And so I can say, hey, what does it look like if we were addicted to something?
Right.
You know, and so I can have that kind of discussion with them, and they can start to understand. And because they understand, then they can self-choose how to regulate their time.
Yeah, I'm not even a tech guy, and I wouldn't consider myself addicted to social media, but there came a point where I just had to say, you know, whoa, I could see how this is like drawing me down rabbit holes. Yeah. And then just this need to modulate it too. Yeah. To step back. And,
and especially since the technology that we have now is different than the technology when I grew up. When I grew up, you couldn't connect with your friends online playing these games, right? They had to be there with you, right? And then so during this pandemic, how it adds another layer because they can't be there with you, right? But the technology has advanced so that you can actually still play with them even through these video games, and so. Yeah, it's not the same, and they'd rather be together, but... Yeah.
Now, you grew up in New York City. I grew up in the suburbs of Seattle. You grew up in New York City. I bet that was somewhat of a different context than the suburbs of Seattle. For me, seeing this meme on social media, it was a picture of about 5 or 6 BMX bikes dumped in a front yard, laying in a front yard, and the caption read, "Our original social network." And that's true, you know, it was like you rode bikes around the neighborhood, and you went to your buddy's house, and that was the network, right? That's right. New York City might have been a little different.
Well, New York City, we did a lot of that networking as well. And sometimes it's even easier because depending on how dense the population is where you live, it will look differently. So I've had friends that live in apartment buildings, and because you're in an apartment building, I mean, the interaction is really easy, right? Because you're there with each other all the time. I lived in Queens, in Whitestone, so it was a little bit, it wasn't apartment buildings, but it was kind of like 4-plex houses together, right? And so you had, it was a neighborhood, and so I did a lot of interacting with my neighborhood friends. And so we made clubs. I remember sitting out on the stoop, right, for hours at a time talking. We'd stay out in the middle of the night to throw a football or baseball around, and so we did a lot of connecting outside. And so it was one of the intentional decisions of choosing the house here that we had too, because it was a neighborhood setting. I mean, we could have, Camino Island has a lot of variance, and so you can get places where you can't even see somebody. But we were in a neighborhood setting that there are kids that are close by because that's one of the things I grew up with and I enjoyed, and I wanted my boys to have the same experience.
No, that's awesome. Now, you've got a bachelor's in architecture. What institution did you go to for that?
Syracuse University.
So you were on a completely different path before ministry. You were learning about architecture, which is I'm an armchair sort of admirer of architecture, and I love how a space design can influence your experience and how communities interact, how you feel when you interact. Design is such a huge piece of that. Now, I don't know what kind of architecture you were studying, but that question fascinates me, and I wonder if you experienced that in the realm of ministry. You experience good design or bad design, or how would you reflect on that?
Yeah, so our architecture school was heavy on design, and heavier than construction side and things like that. So we got criticized from other schools because we were so much into design. So that plays still an important factor in terms of my ministry. As I go through churches, and so what I tried to do was to ask questions about what the space does to the interaction of people, and how that fits the ministry that you're trying to do.
Yes.
Right. So if it's something that really is too foreign to the people that you're trying to reach, maybe there's an issue, right? Maybe there needs to be some sort of change. So when I did a thesis that was kind of downtown New York City, right in the Bowery section, where there are a lot of homeless people that are outside, and I said, if you put a church in the middle of this space, right, none of these folks would ever go through the doors. And then so I worked a lot with kind of soft spaces in between, trying to create spaces where you can kind of enter, get your foot in, get to know a place, get deeper and deeper and deeper. And then so these kind of several layers of entering into a space is something that I concentrated on, looking at that particular context. And I think, as churches today, we need to take a look at that.
For sure.
Because we call ourselves a lot of times these kind of welcoming communities, right? But when we look at the spaces that we have, how really welcoming is it?
Right.
And to who, right?
Right.
And sometimes we're wondering why we're not reaching some of these folks. I'm not saying it all is architecture, right? But I believe that it all works together, and that could be a definite role to doing something.
It's fascinating to me how even like your unexamined, implicitly held preferences as you undertake a design project can often emerge, or the questions you don't ask, right, will often present themselves in the final product. So it can cut both ways, and I love that design demands that you examine your priorities and how that gets reflected in the final design.
Yeah.
Right. Design rewards intentionality.
That's right.
And I feel like that's a message that the church can internalize on a couple different levels.
Yeah. So, asking the questions are a part of the whole thing. When you're part of a design school, it's not really about the end product, but it's about the journey.
Yeah.
Right? It's not really about where you get, but so even when I was working on my final projects, getting ready to present, my professors would still come with tracing paper over my final project as I'm inking the thing in, right? and challenging me on different ways of thinking. So that never ends. And that's why a lot of architects, they actually can't live in the houses that they design themselves, because those buildings are always talking to them.
Yeah.
And so if it's a place that they're trying to get some rest, a lot of times they can't even get rest in their own homes.
That's fascinating
Yeah.
to me. I want to bring this forward to your ministry specifically. I know that you served Christ the Servant Lutheran in Bellingham. You served Bethany Lutheran on Bainbridge Island, which must have been a beautiful context to be in. And then we know you mostly because you've been, for a number of years, you were the chaplain at Josephine. Huge ministry. Now you've accepted, I think in the last year or two, I can't remember, you have accepted a call to work with the Bishop of the Northwest Washington Synod as, I think, what we would call in Episcopal language, the canon to the ordinary, but I think it has a different name. What's the name in the Lutheran Synod?
Assistant to the bishop.
Assistant to the bishop, okay. And how is it that you're bringing this process of asking the right questions to get the right outcomes in the ministry that you're currently engaged in at the Northwest Washington Synod?
Yeah, so I'm happy about the roles that I'm asked to play in the synod itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then so a couple of areas are kind of under my leadership or coordination pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of them is to be a part of candidacy. So candidacy helps people who are exploring going into the ordained ministry, if this is the right path for them.
Mm-hmm.
So of course you can imagine the wonderful questions that can come in that, and even challenging the candidates to really ask themselves whether that is the right path for them. Mm. There was one candidate just the other day that we said we'd like to postpone our decision here, mm-hmm. Whether to go forward or not, because when we heard your passions, mm-hmm. we're just imagining that if you went into the ordained ministry, that you wouldn't be able to fulfill the things that make you excited right now. So we're asking that you kind of consider this again to see if this is really the right path for you, and especially if they're older, mm-hmm. because if they're older, what the thinking that it used to be was that there was only one path. Mm-hmm. But now we're kind of really, especially our, the Lutherans, where we kind of really focus in on the priesthood of all believers and and how to lean into that. We were just kind of suggesting that maybe the best path for you still in a ministry setting might be as a layperson. Mm-hmm. And how can we support that? How can we respect that? Mm-hmm. So asking those questions are incredibly important. I also work with congregations that are in transition. It's a little bit different than the Episcopal Church. The congregations that are in transitions, usually, transitions or leadership positions. So to help walk with them through those transitions and asking the right questions about where God is calling them and how do we best position ourselves to what God is calling us to do. I've turned those things into things that I feel that I'm more gifted to. So you mentioned my work as a chaplain at Josephine. Part of the big experience there was to do pastoral care. Mm-hmm. So I've had to change my thoughts about some of these transition pieces with congregation and say, hey, that's kind of like pastoral care as well, except it's not just with individuals, although we're always talking about individuals, right? But also with the congregation, how it's feeling, the questions that it needs to ask, really leaning into their transition time to look into themselves and to ask God, where, God, are you leading me now? Yeah. That may be totally different than where I was before. Right. Those are incredibly introspective, and then eventually, outer perspective answers and discernment that they get to go through. And then so I love being able to do that with congregations and journeying with them. And basically that's what the synod means. The word synod means that we are walking together.
Mm.
And so even the word synod is a great guide for the work that I do and how I do it.
So you have never stopped being a pastor. That's what I love, is that this was not a dissimilar experience in many ways, because you're walking with people.
That's right.
And you're asking them questions that take them deeper.
That's right.
Which is a continuation of what I perceive as your core calling, if I may project onto you.
Yes.
As pastor, which is pretty wonderful. It, to me, speaks to the faithfulness of God that calls us according to our gifts and abilities and out of God's wisdom. I see that in this story, and it's been great. I hope that your experience thus far has been life-giving.
It has, and mostly because I've been able to make that kind of switch in myself.
Mm-hmm.
If I wasn't able to do that, and I saw this as totally foreign to what I've been called to do as pastor, one, I probably wouldn't enjoy it as much as I do. But secondly, I'm not sure I would be doing it anymore.
Right.
Because I know what God has called me to do.
Right.
Right? And if I stray too far from that call, right, I have to question myself whether I'm following God's call.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I'm happy that this switch was able to happen so that I can really even enter more fully into the work that the church has called me to be a part of.
That's awesome. Andy, we share a number of things in common, but one among them is we both love the work and writings of Rene Girard. And I was so glad to look down and see that you had provided that note to me, and because I love his work too. I think it's immensely profound and helpful, especially in the current moment. Tell me about what you love about Girard, and maybe for folks at home who he is and what, in a nutshell, he is putting forward.
So Rene Girard is, so he's a theologian, but his background is in anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
So he carries that with him, which I think is very helpful because that particular lens, I think, helps us in terms of owning up to what is human stuff. And so that we can more clearly see, I think, what is God's stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when we mix those two things together, I think that's when we get in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
A great example is the creation story, right?
Mm-hmm.
When the humans fell into the trap of thinking that we need to be like God and that God is holding something back from us, right? That's when we bite the apple.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we get in trouble,
Mm-hmm.
right? We are not comfortable the way that God made us as being the created ones with a creator, right? And then so that kind of reminder is important all the time. But a lot of the pieces that I appreciate about Rene Girard come around things like his lens of looking at things of how we scapegoat people all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And how sometimes that scapegoat becomes a sacred thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then so putting our blame on people, right? We then project that blame onto God and say, God now is angry at them or in spite of them, where the gospel then blows that wide open, right?
Yeah.
And so we're challenged by a Christ that says that we should love not only everybody, but even our enemies.
Yes.
We have a Christ that heals all those who have been demonized, not only by, maybe some sort of spiritual spirit, but demonized by the community, right? And that is even worse sometimes than any spiritual type of thing, right? And then so to take a look at that scapegoating, to take a look at how we are blinded by some of the human things that we do, and then when we can begin to be honest with those things, then I think our perspective can be different.
Yeah.
Then we can really appreciate the grace that God gives to us. We can really be transformed by this grace, and then act out of that grace, and even be critical about the traditions that have formed us for so long, right? That maybe sometimes have taken too much of a sacred place that we don't see what we're doing sometimes. So I don't criticize the Pharisees and Sadducees too much, because I think we need to see ourselves too when we are Pharisees and Sadducees. When our sacred religions have blinded us from discovering this kind of radical grace from God.
A thinker that I appreciate I was watching a YouTube channel, and he was saying it's very easy for us to watch something like Schindler's List and see ourselves in the role of, say, a prisoner, or identify with those being harmed. But we really need to be able to see that we could be possibly, if we were in that world, in that context, it's very well we could be the guard.
Yes.
It's very well we probably wouldn't be. We'd probably be one among the SS, right? It's and so to your point, seeing that we're capable of those things as well.
Yes.
It actually frees us up then to choose against them.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of value in making sure that when you read the scriptures that we have, right, to make sure that you're free enough to put yourself in those different places.
Right.
So for instance, the Good Samaritan story, right? Where do we place ourselves in the Good Samaritan story? And I think there's power in the various places, right? Certainly, there's power in saying that, okay, we may be the elite, right? And so who do we consider good neighbors to us, right? Are we the ones that are stepping over people, right? Or are we the Good Samaritan that is showing out to help somebody, right? But it's also good to be free enough to say, hey, maybe sometimes there's a lot of power in asking if what comes if we are the one that is beaten down. And there are times that we are beaten down. Sure. And not only beaten down, but the power is that when we are beaten down, can we accept help from those who we totally despise?
Exactly.
That makes you dig deep. Right?
So Rene Girard is fascinating in all these realms, because he does a great exploration in his book. This book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. As you said, he's an anthropologist, but a literary anthropologist. So he's looking at how humanity sees itself and functions and tells its stories by studying the myths of multiple cultures across time. And what he's found is this idea of a scapegoat mechanism. There's societies identify the evil among them, and they turn on them, they expel them from their midst to purify them, and either exile this person or put them to death, thus restoring thus restoring order in societies. And you see this again and again throughout history of mythologies that have been created. And you see this in the Oedipal story. But the biblical witness is fundamentally different. It appears to function on the same rules as mythology, but in fact it's different. If you take the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, you see the same thing. Joseph is the favored one, and his brothers do what? They conspire to get rid of the one that's disrupting their harmony, which is Joseph. And so they beat him and just fall short of killing him, and they sell him into slavery. They expunge him. They cast him out, right? And so he becomes the focal, and he rises, right, through the ranks by his wit, similar to Oedipus, who becomes king eventually. But Joseph never takes his revenge, right? What you see again and again through the biblical stories is that the scapegoat mechanism is at play, just as it is in all other mythological stories.
Yeah.
But in all previous stories, this is where he's profound. In all previous stories, implicit in the story is the assumption, the given, that the single victim deserved to be expelled or done away with. And the biblical story says, no, collective violence is never, ever okay, even on people we think deserve it, and maybe especially, right? And Joseph had a lot of privilege. He had a coat of many colors. He was favored by his father, right? There were reasons for his brothers to feel like they were second-class citizens. And they reacted sort of accordingly. But the biblical witness is no, no, no.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and let me expand on that, because it's true that our biblical witness, so that collective violence, right, is not a part of who God is, right? And you can we might put that kind of on a justice kind of standpoint, right? But I think the other thing that Rene Girard tries to point us to is that it's also not the way that we were meant to be connected, right? And then so that scapegoat mechanism, what he's trying to say is that communities have been built upon the power of that scapegoat mechanism,
right? Because
we have a common enemy. That's enemies that are normally enemies together now kind of find some sort of commonality because they have a common enemy.
Want to unify a country, go to war, right?
Right.
This is that.
That's right. So Rene Girard, I think he's challenging whether in the image of God that we were made, if that is the fundamental thing that should connect us. Right. He says no, right? We were fundamentally made to be connected as people who are forgiving, right? Who are loving together, right? Who are centering those marginalized, right? The folks that and that kind of forgiveness and that kind of grace that we show is the foundation, and not this mechanism that we sometimes don't even see that we're doing.
This is the witness of Christ,
right?
Right. The Christ is this full embodiment of love in word and action, who is then made the scapegoat, and it plainly exposes the foundational evil so often at play. And the only thing that unveils it for what it is Christ, really, right?
Incredibly powerful.
It's incredibly powerful. Yeah, and so I'd say to everyone at home, if you haven't read Rene Girard, look him up online. If you want a book, I would recommend this one, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. This is an excellent, and it's not a long read. It's a couple hundred pages, and it's the most accessible of his work. So as I look out on our current moment, I see this Girardian perspective. I see this this working at the extremes, right? I wonder how you might show how this scapegoating is working on the far right, but also it's working on the far left.
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that it does is that it tries to challenge the way that we see things, right? So are we doing things, that are politically driven, right? Or are we working out of truly the way that God has made us to be? And so it challenges all those isms that we find ourselves putting ourselves into. It challenges us in a fundamental way to see something different. And so I think it challenges us in terms of how we so easily see the world in dualistic ways. I've grown up that way myself. Everything is dualistic. I'm the same as my boys who like superheroes, and it was always the good guys versus the bad guys. It was always the cowboys versus the Indians. It was, always Popeye coming in to save Olive from all the bad people, right? And so we've grown up this way, and I think one of the things that Girard tries to do is say, hey, be careful about that. Be really careful.
Be really careful.
Because God is one, right? There is no dualism in God. There is no death in God. God is all about life.
Yes.
And how is it that we now retrain ourselves to look into the world without that kind of dualism? In the unity that God is. And so I think this is one of the real challenges of the love your enemy passage.
Yeah.
What it's trying to say is that there is no dualism.
Right.
And so every time we fall into that dualism,
that's right.
We are seeing in a way not that we're not made.
So if you find yourself agreeing almost exclusively with one side entirely, you might want to examine if you've fallen, maybe unwittingly, into a dualistic mindset rather than finding the center.
Right.
I always say, let's not be left or right. Let's be here in the middle with Christ.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I got to tell you, it's not easy.
It's not easy.
It's not easy. Even though I've been involved in social justice a lot, and social justice, right, is, we want to say that there's so good, right? But I think even social justice can fall into that category, where it says that this is just and no other way, right? And as long as we keep carrying that dualism, there will be we won't ever discover any kind of unity together.
I'm reminded of a passage in the Bible that the disciples are worried about a guy casting out demons in Jesus' name, and he says, "Don't worry, if he's not against us, for us. But I hear a lot of folks kind of saying, if you're not fully with me in all my points of view, then you're against me, and you're in some sense part and parcel of every problem I see in the world. And you can't move forward in dialogue or in any productive way absent empathy, generosity of spirit, openness of mind, patience to take the long, hard road of journeying together, not the short one of demanding solutions that should have happened yesterday. As a good friend of mine says, he likes to say often, these things just aren't microwavable, right? And
yes, so important to be able to find ways that we can connect. There are tons of, I mean, I'm not saying that we need to water everything down.
right.
So that we can say, okay, we're more alike than not. But in those places where we can claim together,
That's right.
right? Why aren't we putting as much energy into that, right, as in the places that we differ and that we see differently? Let's do something together, right? That we can say that this is there's something right in this world that we can do together, rather than just being at each other's throats. Right?
Andy, this has been a real privilege to be able to sit down with you and share these thoughts and just catch up with you a bit. And you have a wonderful ministry that God is working through, that as far as I can see. I just pray that it continues to be life-giving and that it continues to strengthen the church that is the Northwest Washington Synod. God bless you. Thank you for being here. And
and thank you for your partnership. This congregation that you're a part of here, and even personally. I mean, I remember back with Josephine when we sat outside my office for long periods of time and connecting about our lives and everything. So thank you so much for partnering together with me in this ministry. It is great to do that with you.
All right. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.